most of the younger listeners would be familiar with the CD releases, which were the English releases. Can you give us like the foundation of what happened in terms of the American releases and why that took place?
I can boil it down.
Okay.
The Beatles would put out a 14-song record in Great Britain. It would come over here, and this happened to pretty much every group. I think every group. Happened to Stones, happened to Who. Their 14-track album became a 12-track album. In the Beatles' case, because Capitol began to see the potential of it right away, the 14-track album became an 11-track album. And this is, and the reason, there are two reasons for that. One of which is, so that meant every second album they had 6 tracks, right?
Right.
That hadn't come out here. Plus which, for reasons that were almost peculiar to the Beatles, a lot of people think that it's true of all British bands that nobody put their singles on their albums. That's not true. But the Beatles didn't put their singles on the albums, often as not. Right? So what happens in America is those singles tracks go with the 6 tracks that are left over from the last 2 albums. You take 5 of the singles tracks, you take those 6 tracks, now you got another album that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world.
And economically, you make some more money.
Hundreds of thousands of dollars, which in today's terms is tens of millions of dollars.
Right. So the first album we get in America is Meet the Beatles. And that was the one that we all remember.
Meet the Beatles is a big hit single that is not on a British album. It is a large number of tracks from their first album, and if I remember correctly, it's got a couple of things that were on the British second album, too. But there are 2 other factors in this. First of all, Capitol Records had assigned all of its international repertoire, and this means everything from Indian classical music to German beer garden bands to English rock bands, to a guy named Dave Dexter, who hated rock music and was adamant and aggressive about it. And that is the reason that the first 3 or 4 singles, including She Loves You, for God's sake, Please Please Me, Do You Want to Know a Secret, all of them came out on these little, basically R&B-oriented and early rock-oriented, but mostly they were, VJ Records, which is a great R&B label. The only other white act I can think of that they had was they somehow wound up with 4 Seasons too.
Mm-hmm.
But basically, was a black record label. The Beatles' early singles end up on labels like that. Well, they have economic problems. They have distribution problems. They don't have the money to promote things the way Capitol did. And finally, Brian Epstein goes and says to the guy who ran some lord of some guy, some titled gentleman, Sir Billy Who, or whatever his name was, you're putting out the next Beatles record on Capitol Records in America. We're going to be on the Ed Sullivan Show. We just made the biggest hit that we've made so far, and you are putting the record out. And I don't know what the alternative was. Probably the alternative was that they wouldn't deliver a record at all to any part of the company unless EMI agreed to do that. EMI owned Capitol in the U.S. So now they have to put them out. Dave Dexter is still in charge. It's Dave Dexter who decides what tracks to leave off Rubber Soul and with the Beatles to make the second album, to make eventually, all the kind of records that, I'm trying to remember, was Beatles 65 a record in Britain?
No, it wasn't.
I'm sure of any of it. Yeah, and Beatles 6 wasn't a record in Britain. Yesterday and Today wasn't an album.
Right. Something New?
Something New wasn't an album.
And the early Beatles was basically the VJ release, which actually predates Meet the Beatles, introducing the Beatles.
Kind of, it's the VJ release. It's what it is it's all the things that didn't come out on Capitol and had been licensed to these other companies.
Right.
Capitol took them back. In the case of the stuff they'd licensed to VJ, they unquestionably took them back illegally. But VJ, which was having economic problems for other reasons, was in no position to fight them, so they just bullied their way into it. They stole them back, basically. The final thing about these releases is that Dave Dexter deliberately messed up the sound, what these records sounded like. He wanted them to sound like crap, and he made them sound like crap. And how he did it is fascinating because he was getting, basically, he had to go in and deliberately sabotage the mastering of the record. You know, he wasn't getting, 2-inch tape that he could remix, but he could go in just in the mastering process and what little he could do with the 2-track that George Martin did send him and screw things up completely. Now, this is the Beatles. It was, in fact, impervious to being screwed up. Nevertheless, I mean, meaning that the music stayed great, even though he did his damnedest to make it not great.
Right.
Now, where this all comes out, and the proof of the pudding really is, when John died, Dave Dexter was working for Billboard magazine. And he wrote, actually, you have to imagine, John Lennon's died is a national trauma. It's an international, it's a worldwide trauma. And this asshole, writes a hostile obituary in Billboard magazine. Just a character assault, a musical assault. It was one of the most offensive things I've ever read about anything.
Back to the original point, despite Dave Dexter's attempts to sabotage the albums, sometimes he really got it right, and that's sort of the crux of the second album book that you wrote, right?
Well, the only reason he got it right was because it was impossible to get it wrong.
But, I mean, the sequencing...
If you take...
Yeah.
Okay, so here's the Beatles' second album, okay? It's got one Paul lead vocal. It's got one George lead vocal. I can't think... I don't even think there is a Ringo lead vocal on it. Maybe I'm forgetting something. So it's mostly a John Lennon record, which is ironic because of them all, the one that Dave Dexter hated the most was John. First of all, he hated the harmonica, the way John played it, which is enormously amusing. I mean, some of those Beatles, the early singles, and that's part of the Beatles' second album thing, because She Loves You, that's the album She Loves You's on. It's not on any album in the UK until they put out Past Masters, I think, which is already the digital era,
right?
Pretty much, or real close to it.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I think the greatest record is She Loves You, and people say, well, and my thing, if anybody objects to that, I just say, you think they got better, but all they really got was more complicated. They couldn't get any better. You can't make a better record than that. You can't really make a much better record than I Call Your Name, which I'm reading Mark Lewison's book this morning, and I come across, John wrote that song in like 1958 or 59.
Wow.
And they kind of throw it away on an EP, and then Dexter accidentally resurrects it on that album. One of the signature moments of John Lennon's career, Money, their version of the Barrett Strong Motown song Money, which is, just out there. Beatles' second album had 3 Motown tracks on it. It had Please Mr. Postman, Money, and You Really Got a Hold on Me, which was a very, very important record when I was a kid because I was such a Miracles fan.
Because of your book, it caused me to revisit that second album, which I sort of looked at as a throwaway, but it really is more than that. The thing that touched me the most about what you said about the second album is that it proved, after Meet the Beatles, that they were the real deal. There was no Till There Was You. It was a rock and roll record.
A friend of mine, Pete Fornatale Jr., actually, who's an editor, called me and said, I want you to do a book about the Beatles for this little series I'm doing for Rodale Press. So I said, well, I would do it, but you'll never let me do the album I want to do. And he said, what's that? And I said, I want to do the Beatles' second album. He said, you mean with the Beatles? I said, no, I want to do the Beatles' second album. And because Pete's a lot younger, he had to kind of be led by it. And everybody, my agent thought it was crazy. Everybody thought it was crazy. I just kept saying, there's a story here. This is the story. Because I knew you got Dave Dexter. It was the first of the Dave Dexter albums. I knew you got this whole thing of that's when they begin to recover the material that's been licensed to the R&B labels. For me, I was 14, and one of the things I realized in the course of writing this book was, Jesus, Marsh, you're 14 years old, you're already an R&B snob. Because what I meant by not having Till There Was You on it, I don't know exactly what anybody else would mean by that, but not just that there weren't any sappy ballads on it. I like sappy ballads, and you could make a pretty good case that You Really Got a Hold on Me is a sappy ballad. But you could make a pretty good case that She Loves You, if you slowed it down, would be one. But what it was it had the groove, it had that bluesy thing, it had the happy sad thing, that's key to the blues, where you deal with your problems by dancing on them. All of that was on that record, and you didn't get distracted by show tunes and sappy and really sappy ballads that didn't have any beat to them. The second album was like, I trusted them.
Right.
From that moment on, I never distrusted.
Well, and as a teenager, I remember the second album specifically introducing me personally to all of this other great music. I mean, most of the album is cover songs.
Yeah, I guess it is. Well, I don't know most. You got the 3 Motown songs.
You got Chuck Berry, Roll Over Beethoven.
Right, so that's 4 out of 11 right there.
Devil in Her Heart, that's a cover.
Yep, which is almost a Motown song. It's a Detroit record that nobody, had heard at that point. Virtually nobody.
Long Tall Sally, who does it better than Little Richard? Maybe Paul McCartney.
The older I get, the more convinced I become of two things. That Little Richard was the greatest first-generation singer of rock and roll. Against the most formidable challenge ever there was. I mean, already placing him above Ray Charles makes me feel creepy. Or Sam Cooke. But in the end, he was more original. He was more of a rocker. He was what he was. But the other thing is that the greatest Little Richard student in history and was Paul McCartney. And that anybody who could possibly listen to Paul sing, not just, Long Tall Sally, which is brilliant, but, I saw her standing there. Which is the first album, and that's, the other side of that first American single, which, because, I'm getting senile, I can't think of the name of it.
I Want to Hold Your Hand.
I Want to Hold Your Hand. But I saw her standing there, which is kind of the lost song. It was just as big a hit. I saw her standing there. Is Mitch Ryder never sang Little Richard as good as that. And Little Richard sometimes didn't sing Little Richard as good as that. Pure Little Richard record. The whole screaming, the whole thing. And another thing about Mark Lewison's book is you find out that Paul, from when Richard made his first record at 55 or 56, when Paul was, 14 maybe?
Right.
15? He's doing this already. He learns to do it right away. And he does it all the time. Put him anywhere near a piano, and he will stand on it and sing Tutti Frutti.
Right.
Or whatever, And so to me, if you could do that, and you could do Smokey, and you could do something that was as dark and bluesy as that, I keep coming back. It was funny because I wouldn't have said this before I wrote the book, but I keep coming back to I Call You Name, because I Call You Name sounds like it should be, in a certain spiritual sense, like it should be on Rubber Soul. It has the angst. And it sort of has that kind of folk blues feel too, that has something to do with Rubber Soul. So that will, but if you could do all of those things, and She Loves You, I have a thing like where there isn't any greatest rock and roll record except the one you just heard. But do you know what I mean by that? It's like if you listen to She Loves You, it's definitely the greatest rock and roll record you ever heard. If you listen to, if you listen to James Brown singing Please, 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 then you'll be wrong about She Loves You because you'll be right about Please, Please, Please. And that's how greatest records of all time work. But
right.
She Loves You's one. You can't do it better than that. I was talking about it with Derek Taylor, the Beatles publicist, one day, many, many years later, when the Anthology album came out. He thinks about it for a minute, and Derek, who is a very droll fellow, looks at me and he says, "It's a tribute to an English grammar school education, reported dialogue."
Yeah.
And that's what it is.
Yeah.
I mean, you think about She Loves You isn't sung to a girl, it's sung to a guy.
Yeah. That's right.
It's sung to a guy.
Yeah.
Basically what they're saying is, screw this up, and I'm moving in. That's the message.
Right.
The message is, number one, she loves you, and number two, on the other hand, if you're not going to take advantage of that,
I'm there.
Right along.
Yeah, I'm there. Let me ask you: is the second album book still in print? Because I cannot tout that book enough. I think it's
something. I don't know what that even means anymore. It's easy to find.
Well, I think that I love your writing in general, as you know, but I think this is one of the greatest Beatle books ever written, personally, and I
think it's the best. I actually think it's probably just in terms of what it is, which is short.
Yes,
I've written more ambitious things, but this is
absolutely.
This is the best book I wrote. It's the most fun. It's funnier than the Louie book in a way, and I'm very, very proud of that book.